I want to thank all of you who are in this room. Thank you for supporting the incredibly important work that Migrante-BC does with migrant workers. As we've already heard from his head, and as I'll talk about more, we know that there are many issues and challenges that migrant workers face. And one of the big ones is isolation. The coming to a new country, working in isolated workplaces, not knowing where to get help. And one of the really key things that Migrante-BC does is outreach to connect up with those workers, organizing those workers, building connection, building trust, building community, so that migrant workers can bring their stories forward, bring forward their experiences, so that migrant workers can advocate for themselves for change. Bringing forward a community of trust so that migrant workers can bring on these groundbreaking litigation actions like Denny's and the other ones. But it's about building community together. It's about building solidarity. And that's what we're here for tonight. So thank you for your solidarity in supporting Migrante-BC. Thank you for your solidarity, not just tonight, but going forward from today, because there is a lot of work to be done and we all need to be in this fight together. But what we have at this moment is a tremendous opportunity. I'm typically someone who's fairly bleak, but I see an opportunity right now for us to make real inroads on this issue. The Federal Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour has announced that the government will be undertaking what she has called a serious review of the temporary foreign worker program. So this is an opportunity for change. And with that in mind, I think tonight what I'd like to do is just look back and see where have we been, take stock of where we are now, and to talk about where will we go from here together. Where I'd start off with is saying that Canada has lost its innocence on the issue of temporary labour migration. We know too much now to close our eyes to what is going on. Right across the country, groups like Migrante, other groups working with migrant workers, researchers across the country have been bringing forward countless stories of the kind of worker exploitation that is absolutely common under the temporary foreign worker program. We know too much to keep things as they are. But at the same time, over the last couple of years, what has been exposed is how quickly Canadians' fears for their own economic insecurity can be manipulated, can be fanned into hostility and racism and xenophobia. And so we know the risks and we know not to go down that path. So while we have this opportunity for change right now, we also have the responsibility to choose how to act based on what we know. So what do we know? We know that labor migration doesn't just happen, that it takes an awful lot of complicated laws and policies that are enacted by governments, that governments choose to enact in order to make labor migration happen and to happen in the way that it does. Employers demand access to a flexible, reliable, compliant, low-wage workforce. And in response, governments have chosen to enact policies and laws to facilitate that. They've developed the programs that deliver that workforce on terms that very predictably make the workers open to exploitation. There's, as you know, a number of different programs, and there are certainly variations between the details of how those programs run. But what we know is that they all share very similar structures that drive the exact same kinds of vulnerabilities to exploitation. We know that for workers, live-in caregivers and other workers under the temporary foreign worker program, that the private recruitment system is very largely unregulated, and that workers are paying thousands of dollars in illegal fees to get minimum wage jobs in Canada. They have taken out loans that are subject to extortionate interest rates. They come to Canada essentially in debt bondage. We know that under the seasonal agricultural worker program, that even though there is not that private recruitment, that workers are subject to perpetual recruitment, where every year their ability to return is dependent on getting a good word from their employer to be able to name them to come back. So a perpetual system of recruitment. And we have heard about the experiences here as UFCW has brought forward in its litigation about the blacklisting that's occurred when those workers have tried to exercise their constitutional right to unionize. So we know that right from the get-go, those terms that they come in on create a high degree of vulnerability that makes it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to enforce their rights to workplace standards, to the rights in their contract. That's compounded, as you know, by the tied permits that Hesed and Alden have already mentioned, where you can only work for one employer in one workplace doing a specific job. Often housing is also tied. And the Secretary General of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, a couple of years ago at the UN Conference on Development and Migration specifically said that this is a quote from him, tying migrants to specific employers encourages exploitation. We know this is true. This is not a mystery. And the results that we see are entirely predictable. We know about injured workers who are deported the moment that they are injured and no longer able to do what their employers demand. We know about the 4-in, 4-out rule, where after 4 years of labor in this country, workers are considered disposable and sent out of the country for 4 years. And we know they have no paths to permanent residence. What we have done in the labor migration system that we have chosen to build is create a revolving door that creates a working class without rights, because we are talking about working class jobs here. Forget about skill levels, we are talking about class. That we've created a working class that is circulating in and out of the country without status, without an ability to enforce its rights, and without any voice in the democratic process that produces the rights that govern them. And it's relying on groups like Migrante, on the important work that they do, that you are supporting here tonight, in order to bring forward that information, to bring forward the stories of what is actually happening. So we know all this is true. But you asked, didn't we fix that? Didn't we do something 2 years ago in 2014? Has the world not changed? And the answer is basically no. The federal government in June of 2014 introduced a number of changes which were purporting to fix the temporary foreign worker program. At that point, there had been, after many of these stories, a rising public demand that something be done in the face of this exploitation. And so the government introduced a policy under the banner, Putting Canadians First, which was meant to reform this system. But it didn't. In fact, made many things worse. What it did do is all of the reforms, virtually all of the reforms that were introduced at that point, were focused on the first thing that labor migration policies do, which is control which workers, how many workers are allowed to enter the country to work in which industries. And they said that they were doing that in order to protect Canadian jobs. But the fact is that the legal obligation to ensure that migration does not affect Canadian jobs was always there. It was always a legal prerequisite that employers show that they had attempted to hire Canadians in permanent residence and were unable to. And it was always a legal requirement to prove that hiring a migrant worker would have a neutral or positive effect on the Canadian labor market. The reality is that since the mid-2000s, there was a concern that no one was actually watching what was happening there, that there was insufficient supervision. And so the changes that were introduced in 2014 were largely about putting into place the administrative processes to ensure that the government was complying with the obligations under the law. So they have, in many ways, addressed the question of who is allowed to enter, how many workers are allowed to enter. But the question of what are the terms on which the labor is done and who gets to stay are the two areas where change has not been made in any positive sense and has in fact made things better, or made things worse. That the terms on which labor is done still leave workers incredibly vulnerable to exploitation, and the routes to permanence have been narrowed. When we look at what has been done, let me just catalog the ways in which things have not got better. All the key structural elements that produce workers' precariousness that we know about remain in place, right? The work permits that tie workers to a specific employer, the fact that they are short time limited permits, the mandatory departure after 4 years, the failure to regulate exploitative recruitment practices, the fact that we have fragmented complaint-based mechanisms for enforcing workplace rights, which we know don't happen, that you can't enforce your rights when you have to come forward and you risk termination, which is the experience when workers come forward. What else is in place? There's a lack of protection for workers who do raise complaints. So if an employer is failing to comply with their labor market impact assessment that authorizes them to bring workers into the country, that LMIA is revoked, but so are all the work permits that are under it, right? So coming forward to identify an abuse in the system leaves workers worse off. We know that that's still in place, and there are still no pathways to permanent residence for almost all workers who are coming in as working class workers. The second thing is that new elements have been introduced that actually make that precariousness worse. So the work permits that workers have are shorter in duration. They're only 1 year long rather than 2 years long. We know that with the recruitment fees that workers are being paid, it typically takes 2 years to pay off a recruitment fee. And that in order to actually make the journey in 4 years profitable, you've got to be able to stick it out for 4 years. But if the permits end every year, that revolving door spins faster. The precariousness of having to renew your permit over 4 years instead of having just one renewal means that the pressure to comply with any demand of your employer is heightened. There are new application fees that have been introduced on the LMIAs, $1,000. Those are meant to be paid by the employer. They are often being downloaded onto the workers themselves, so the recruitment fees are going up. That's another $1,000 right there. The government introduced hard and declining caps on the number of migrant workers that can be present in any individual workplace. And we know that the Living Caregiver Program has been completely reconfigured. The promise at the heart of that program was that if living caregivers did their 2 years of service, all of them were entitled to apply for and receive permanent residence. Now that promise has been decoupled. So the number of work permits that can be issued in any year for caregivers is unlimited. It's entirely responsive to employer demand, but there's a hard cap on the number of caregivers who can actually get permanent residence. Any caregiver coming in now has no idea whether she'll be able to actually get permanent residence, right? That promise is broken. And all of this was introduced in the context of a government discourse that shifted the focus away from the contributions, the economic and social contributions that migrant workers are making in our community. It was introduced in a discourse that shifted the focus off of the widespread worker exploitation that we're seeing, and instead it was introduced in a context where the discourse reframed migrant labor as a threat to Canadian labor, right? All of that is a highly toxic mix that makes workers much more precarious than they were. So did they fix things in 2014? Absolutely not. What's the common thread in all of this? What the common thread is that choices have been made, that government policy choices have been made that deliberately construct migrant workers as precarious, that engage in an active commodification of labor, a dehumanizing of migrant workers. We know that these are policy choices that drive an erosion of rights, that subject migrant workers to incredible levels of control by employers and recruiters, and enable those people to profit from their precariousness. All of those were active choices. But the thing with policies and laws is, to the extent that we choose to create them, if we don't like the exploitation that we see, if we don't like the outcomes, choose again, right? And this is our chance to choose again. What we have now is a moment to build security together. In this opportunity, will we choose permanent insecurity, or will we choose decent work and decent lives for everyone? We need to directly confront the values that are informing the choices that our governments are making. We need to reject the normalization of temporariness and precariousness. Instead, we need to rebuild a robust permanent immigration system that enables workers of all classes to arrive here with permanent status. We know that if you're good enough to work, you're good enough to stay. We need to build a system that recognizes the importance of family. The federal government has touted the value of family reunification in its new approach to immigration. But we have a temporary foreign worker program that is absolutely premised on family separation for prolonged years, periods of years. It's premised on a system that uses family separation in an instrumental way to drive circularity, to ensure that migrant workers will leave. It is absolutely the antithesis to a family reunification policy, and that needs to change. Migrant workers are not units of production. They are full human beings who are connected to communities and families, and they need to be together. And we need to reject sacrifice zones, right? By which I mean, I'm borrowing from Chris Hedges on this. And what I mean when I talk about sacrifice zones are zones where we say that it is okay to create a two-tier labor market, where some areas of work we are going to relegate to low-wage, low-rights zones that will be permanently staffed by people with temporary status. That must end. That has been a core part of our temporary foreign worker program. It's something where that undermines our general social policy to ensure that everyone has security in society, that everyone has access to decent work and decent lives. To create these low-right, low-wage zones is intolerable in our communities. And in all of this, in affecting all these changes, I've written a number of reports that have detailed recommendations. You've heard from Hesed and from Ari about specific changes that need to be made around eliminating tied permits, eliminating the 4-and-4 rule, ensuring that there's security for workers. But in all of this, we need to go forward with solidarity. We need solidarity across all the different streams of migrant workers. Whether you've come in under different programs, it's the same kind of vulnerability that's being created. We need solidarity amongst people who are documented and people who are undocumented. We need solidarity amongst migrants and the labor movement and civil society. We need solidarity amongst migrants and those with permanent residence. And we need solidarity not just because we need to be good allies, but because this is all the same fight. This is all our fight, whether we are migrants or not. The neoliberal agenda that drives all of us into deeper precarity is part of the same story, whether it's fragmenting jobs into precarious casualized work, whether it's working full-time but still falling below the poverty level, whether it's about a just-in-time workforce that absolves employers in the state from obligations to train and to retrain and to have sustainable careers. It is an erosion of the commons and an erosion of the common good. And we need solidarity transnationally. Labor migration programs, at their foundation, depend on maintaining the deep structural inequality between the global north and the global south. And we need to acknowledge Canada's role and how our temporary foreign worker program plays into that system, right? That it's our demand for labor that helps sustain labor export policies at home, right? Building real security means building security so that migrant workers aren't forced to migrate, so that people have a choice to stay home, right? So that there are sustainable economies in all of our communities, so that people truly can choose whether to stay, to go, to return. In closing, I just want to say that I visited Bahay Migrante this afternoon, and you heard from Ari. It's a wonderful story about how this community has come together and created this home. It's a wonderful space where people can come together, a safe space to meet, a safe space to create art, to have a base for a social life. There are youth committees, there are seniors committees, there's groups working with migrant workers. It is a wonderful, rich home. It is a home that we all need. We need somewhere where we can be together, we can work collectively, and we can be safe at home. And that's what I imagine, that's what we can do together on this journey. When we think about what we need to build together, we need to build that safety, that security for everyone, so all of us can have decent lives and decent work. Thank you so much for your time.